a lot of the times in entrepreneurship and business, there's a lot of Darwinian ideas that come up, survival of the fittest. You always envision this, like, whatever, lion hunting a gazelle. And there's a place for that, I guess. But what doesn't get talked about enough is thinking of the economy based on like a rainforest.
Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
So welcome to an all-new episode of the show. I'll just mention that doing these solo episodes / videos are the hardest. I don't know how these crazy AM radio hosts do it, where they just sit there and like just jabber ideas off the dome for 3 hours, but I'm going to attempt to do that. And there has been some planning and forethought that's gone into this in theory. But I wanted to kind of do a Midsummer Nights podcast on what we're seeing in the agency space when it comes to new business and outbound and keeping the pipeline full and all of those things. And also give a little bit of perspective from our own experience building sales schema, going through different changes and transformations over the years and so on. So if you're here and you're an owner or you're a new business person, you might be in a mode of looking to grow your agency or B2B service company. You might be looking to build equity value and perhaps get acquired in the next few years. This is something that's coming up more and more as Gen Xers and Boomers age out of the space. Or you might just be simply looking to stop this feast-or-famine roller coaster, build something that is more reliable and stop staring at the ceiling so much in a cold sweat every single night. So my goal of this episode is that by the end, you'll have a lot more clarity and a lot more ways to think about this in a way to create peace of mind and so on. So with that in mind, you may have heard this from us before, but what we've sort of seen over the years from agencies that have gone through these different stages of growth is really there's like 4 major stages, and we've been in all of them at different points of time in our company. And the first is glorified freelancer. So this is where you might have started your agency. Maybe you were really good at a particular service, and then you basically were running around doing all the jobs in the company, eventually getting help and going onwards from there. At that point, it's really just about getting results and getting good at something enough so that you can get to the next level. The next level is Cobbler's children. That's level 2. That's where we find most of our clients. And here's the thing, is that it's really not attached to a revenue number so much. We've worked with agencies that are scraping 8 figures that are healthily in the Cobbler's children realm. We've also worked with plenty of agencies that are, low 7s that I would say are beyond it. The thing that defines the Cobbler's children is that most, or if not all, of the business is reactive. It's coming from the personal networks of the owners, and that makes it very difficult for the agency to plan effectively, to get a decent multiple at acquisition, or to do any number of things. There are basically just reactive habits, and there really isn't that infrastructure for getting first meetings, but then closing business consistently outside of referrals and personal networks. From there is stage 3, which is the transitional agency. We threw this one in because sometimes what we see is that the agency starts to get traction with a particular approach. They start to get others outside of the ownership doing new business, but it's a little bit fragile, and things can kind of things could go either way. Either you're going to backslide or you're going to get up to the next level. And the 4th is the enterprise. And this is an agency that's been able to make multiple channels work for getting meetings and for keeping the pipeline full. They're able to plan effectively. They've really cornered their market, and they're doing well. Owners are fully out of the sales seat so that they can do whatever they want, including sales if they so choose. So that's the idea, and that's regardless of whether you want to hit 8 figures or 7 or whatever you want to do. Basically, these stages are orthogonal to those revenue goals you might have. So it's really just a way to build a healthy organization that can respect your lifestyle or whatever else you want to achieve. And these are the reoccurring themes we've seen across, working with more than 200 agencies, talking to thousands more over the years. So with that in mind, I wanted to throw some ideas in here. Like, I think that a lot of the times I'm very tempted to just run down tactical rabbit holes with people based on what's working for our clients. So we'll get to that fun stuff, but I don't want to start talking about LinkedIn or Clay tables or anything like that right away, because all of that is, window dressing on top of more foundational stuff that's more important. The first is something that I've talked a lot about. You're probably sick of hearing it from myself and others, which is the importance of specialization. A lot of the times in entrepreneurship and business, there's a lot of Darwinian ideas that come up, survival of the fittest. You always envision this like whatever lion hunting a gazelle. And there's a place for that, I guess. But what doesn't get talked about enough is thinking of the economy based on like a rainforest and these little pockets of specialization. And like if you ever watch those David Attenborough documentaries, there's so much that's talked about based on like a certain part of the canopy and a certain part of the jungle. And the question is, what makes you think that you are going to fight that dynamic, right? So specialization is becoming so important. It doesn't have to mean verticalization. You could be specializing horizontally. I think this is a little bit tougher and less common, but it's absolutely possible. Like we've had clients that build like custom ERP systems, and it doesn't matter if they're working with like a hospital or Fortune 500 or whatever, it's the same thing. But for most of our clients, this means honing in on either one vertical or a few verticals that have very similar needs, and then doing maybe one to a handful of select services for them to solve a very specific problem. Now, tied to this, and one thing that's been helpful for me is thinking about specialization as a tech startup would. A lot of the times, like in any space, this is kind of the counter to getting overly specialized, is that like we want to be specialized as an organization and in terms of the problems that we solve, so then people can refer us easily. Marketing and sales becomes more focused and easier. But as people, as owners, entrepreneurs, new business people, we actually kind of want to do the opposite. And we want to think in a more heterodox way, get ideas from other places, and become more diversified. So with that in mind, an example of that is looking at the way that billion-dollar tech startups really start themselves up. And most of them, the way that they're thinking about the problem that they want to solve and the market that they want to take on is they think about TAM, or total addressable market, first. There's a really simple equation that a lot of these companies use, which is ARPU, which stands for annualized revenue per user, or for you, it would be per client, times the number of clients or customers in the market, times the percentage that you think you can actually win in that market, should be greater than or equal to. If you're a startup, you might put $100 million there. For us, you want to think about whatever that long-term revenue is that you want to achieve, such as, 7, 8 figures, 9 figures, whatever it is for you. There aren't that many 9-figure agencies anymore, but it is what it is. So that's the first thing, is kind of thinking about that opportunity. But that's not all, right? Because I think a lot of the times people are just sort of looking at where the growth is and not thinking about what their custom skill set is, where they are already, what they have to build on, and they're just sort of chasing growth. Even if that's not you and you're not just like chasing the next shiny object, I still see this with lots of agencies that might be working with a handful of verticals. So they have like B2B tech, cybersecurity, and then they're like, let's go ahead and work with AI companies because that's where all the growth is happening. The problem with that is the agency may or may not have any edge there, and they are competing against the smartest people on the planet, because that's where those people are flocking to, is of course with AI. So one thing I like to think about is like, if you have something as abundant as clothing, there are multiple measurements that customize it to the person wearing it, right? So like, why should business opportunities be any different? An opportunity isn't just something you pick up off the ground. It's something that you have to try on and make sure that it works for you. So just because there's growth and TAM in one place doesn't necessarily mean it's the right fit. So that's the first thing, is kind of figuring out that specialization, and it's going to be a process. I think that is something that's been talked a lot about. You're probably like, okay, Dan, move on to the next thing. But I think that was a thing that was sort of a weirder, not so much necessary thing to have, and now it's become table stakes. The next thing that is newer that I think is going to become table stakes in the next few years is perspective. So what do I mean by that? There is the classic question from Peter Thiel, controversial figure, love him or hate him. He does have some great questions, which is basically, what important truth do you believe the very few people agree with you on? You're not going to be able to just come up with what that thing is overnight, but it's something to start thinking about, and it will guide your perspective over time. And the reason that I think perspective is going to become so important is that the line between deciding what you should do, i.e. the thing that you think is important, And actually performing that thing for a client or doing the work is becoming thinner and thinner. Yes, AI is a big part of that and is going to become an even bigger part. But also, even before that, this has been ramping up over time, right? Because we have a more globalized workforce, it's cheaper and easier to hire talent to get things done, and so on. But the agencies that are going to win are the ones that take it further, the ones that actually identify a problem that needs to be solved and then say, hey, you've been trying to solve it this way, but actually you should be solving it this other way. I think there's other dimensions in which this perspective can play out. You might have a different perspective in terms of how the work should be done, i.e., hey, most people are just doing media buys to solve this problem, but actually you should be looking at more organic or vice versa to solve this problem would be an example. It could be how you do the work. Hey, most brands are hiring an agency full-time to do this, or they're getting a full-time person. We actually work with the stable of freelancers that add these other things to the equation. This is a way better way to solve this problem, and we think it's wrong that it's being solved this way. For years, I worked with a sales consultant named John Logar. It's been like more than a decade now. He worked with physical therapists, and they introduced a concept called flipping the pyramid, where most people, they would get hurt or whatever, they would go to the doctor, they would get cut up in surgery, and then they would go to the physical therapist. So they introduced the flipping the pyramid concept, which is go to the physical therapist first, and then if that doesn't work, then get surgery. And now that's become, pretty common as an idea. Another way of thinking about perspective is how you charge, and tied to that is how clients get to realize that value. An example of this is there's more and more agencies, including ours, that are not just looking to jump on a client as if riding a bull and hold on to them for as long as they can. They're basically saying okay, our goal is to work with you as long as you think that this is helpful. And if you're ever ready to internalize it, we will show you how to build this in-house. I'm not saying that you should necessarily do that, but it is something that is becoming a much bigger opportunity for more and more organizations out there. And as these lines between planning and doing become more and more blurry, the demand to in-house and the volatility is going to go up. So that is going to be a route that I think more and more agencies will take. And people like Greg Hickman and Alt Agency are really betting on that as well. So what's our perspective? And it's something that we've really honed over time, and it's okay if it evolves, and ours probably will evolve too. But it's basically that most people believe that information and marketing and attention is the scarce resource. And our belief is that with complex services, trust is the scarce resource. So when I say that, you might be like, yeah, Dan, everybody thinks that trust is in demand, but that may be true. And if you're in conversation with somebody, they'll nod their head at that. But if you look at what 99% of salespeople are doing, it runs completely counter to that. The messaging that you see and everything is really assuming that if only people knew about this thing, they would buy from me. So everything we do and all the outreach that we're creating is based on trust being the scarce resource. And I'll get more into that later. So let's say you don't completely have specialization and or perspective nailed. And maybe you're thinking about, hey, let's just take this next 6 to 12 months. We'll draw on a whiteboard and figure it out. Bad idea. This reminds me of that friend. We all have that friend, right? That they go through a bad breakup and they're like, I'm going to spend the next year working on myself. Then 1 year becomes 2 years, becomes 5, and they just become worse and worse and more insular. And the reality is you can work on yourself while dating. It doesn't have to be super high stakes. You don't have to be devoting yourself to a new person immediately, but that those things are not at odds with each other, and they're not mutually exclusive. Same goes for business. I know I hate the dating metaphors too that people always bring up in sales, but sometimes they're hard to avoid. But anyway, likewise, you can build perspective and figure out what your specialization is by actually going out to the market, building relationships, having conversations, selling things, running test engagements and test projects. You can draw on a whiteboard for 6 months, but eventually that Mack truck of reality is going to run over that whiteboard. And if you don't have everything nailed down, that's actually okay. You can be honest and ethical about that. When we transitioned from a done-for-you prospecting company for agencies to a training and implementation model, in the first 6 months or so, I would say to everybody, hey, this is a newer product for us. It's going to be a little bit chaotic and rougher around the edges. The upside is I'm going to be more personally involved in it, and the investment is going to be lower than it ever will be in the future. We got a higher close rate from that, I think by orders of magnitude, than we did after, once we got rid of that disclaimer. We still got rid of it because it just wasn't true anymore. But that's just to say that people don't always want the thing that it's like tested 100 times over. A lot of the times people want the thing that is sort of custom and honest. And this is why we buy handcrafted porcelain instead of just going to Bed Bath and Beyond all day. There's pros and cons to both, but you can make the first work if you're still developing your specialization and your perspective. But back to thinking like startup owners or even hedge fund owners, there is going to be some risk to this, and you can't avoid it, and you are accumulating risk no matter what. If you do nothing and stay the course, you're accumulating risk because you're not taking advantage of the opportunities that are out there, and you might not be building something that has value. So one of the objections that we get to specializing is, let's say I pick an industry or a few different verticals and then there is an economic downswing. Let's say that I pick gyms and then we have another pandemic. And the reality is, yeah, like you're going to be in some trouble there. And the answer to that problem is to keep a healthy enough business to ride out the storms. But the reality is those agencies that focused on gyms and really weathered the storm, I'm guessing that they are stronger than almost anybody else out there right now, because everybody that was just being a dilettante and wasn't willing to put in the time got wiped out during COVID. And now there's even less competition than there was. I know I'm going to get some pushback from that because I'm sure that there are gym-focused agency owners having trouble with that, but it is what it is. Great. So we talked about specialization and we talked about perspective. The next foundational element is mindset, and specifically as it applies to sales and new business. So what I've noticed from having thousands of conversations with agency owners over the last decade is that people that are kind of in that cobbler's children stage tend to be thinking about, asking about, worried about slightly different things than people at a higher stage, like that enterprise level. People in the cobbler's children stage are asking me like, hey, Dan, what are other agency owners seeing right now? Like we saw this little like rise in Q1, now down in Q2, and there's this thing happening in the economy, and there's this issue with Iran over there. It might affect our business. So basically they're focusing on the external. They're focusing on macro events. The second thing they do is they're thinking about prospecting as something that they do when they need to, when the chips are down. And then the third thing that they're doing is they are making excuses for not prospecting. Like, hey, I was busy. We just got a giant proposal, so I didn't prospect because we don't really feel like we need to. I went on vacation. There was this and that issue with a client. Whatever it is, there's always a good reason. And then you sort of like look at an average of maybe 14 days lost per excuse, and then you compound that over a year, and you realize like, okay, the prospecting is really going on maybe 2 or 3 months out of the year. So the stars have to align. So what does the enterprise agency look like? So when we talk to these people, and again, they could be at any revenue level, doesn't really matter, but they're just thinking about things a little bit differently. They're focusing on the internal changes that they have made and things that they have done differently as opposed to things that might be going on in the outside world. It's not to say that stuff in the outside world never matters. I just brought up pandemics and gyms. Obviously, that's a thing. But 9 times out of 10, what the enterprise agency is doing is they're like, okay, if we saw this fluctuation in business or leads, chances are it's something that we did differently. And 9 times out of 10, that is the reality. Hey, we went after a slightly different vertical than we usually do, or we were doing this number of outreaches 3 months ago, or we decreased ad spend, or whatever it is. They're able to tie their current reality to the things they did or didn't do a few months prior. Are they always accurate with that? No, but they're much more on the money than trying to tie, some macroeconomic change to what's currently going on. The second thing is, obviously, this is the reverse of what I just said with the cobbler's children. They're prospecting consistently every day, no matter what, because that's their job. This is the classic, like, do you, want to lose 10 pounds or do you want to be healthy sort of thing? Like they're going to the gym and they're eating healthy because that's what you do. And if you stop doing it, then you go back to the other way. And then obviously they're not making excuses. Looking at the things that they did or didn't do, and all these things prevent them from blaming an outside force or something when they don't prospect. So those things are all important. The other element of mindset, if you're with me so far and maybe you're in that cobbler's children boat and you want to get out of it, is really looking to play longer games in your sales process and getting ready for those longer games. So let me tell you what I mean. Let me back up a little bit. If you're thinking about the ways to win new business, there's really only 3 ways overall. There's all sorts of tactical stuff, but high level, there's reactive referrals. And if that was enough, you probably want to be listening to this. There's inbound marketing, which is, doing content or ads or whatever, trying to get people to come to you. And then there's outbound, which is reaching out to people. And as I'll talk about later, the last 2 are very symbiotic with each other. And the reality is that, let's say you pick a particular vertical or a few different verticals that you want to focus on, only 3% of that market is actively looking for a solution. Now, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 5%, 3 is the common placeholder, and that conforms to what we've typically seen. So let me give an example. So we have a client that has been well specialized. They're clearly in that transitional or enterprise space looking, and they focus on health systems. So they already have leads coming in, and we're helping them just make outbound a little bit better. They're focusing on large hospital groups. And in that market, when we dig into it, there's around 600 hospital groups in the US that they can work with. So that means that out of those 600 hospitals, there are 15 that are actively looking to hire an agency. So you might hear that and be like, great, let's just go find a way of getting those 15 into our doors. So there's a couple of issues with that. First is that it's not super easy to hone in on those 15 hospital groups. Yes, there's intent data, there's all sorts of bells and whistles you can use, but it's still tough at the end of the day. But even if you do manage to find those 15 and you've somehow solved this needle in a haystack problem, guess what? Again, trust is the scarce resource. They don't know, like, or trust you yet. And even if you manage to get the meeting with them, which is also another needle haystack timing sort of thing, they're probably going to hire the agency that they met weeks, months, or years prior. So part of the mindset change is going from I am doing lead generation and I am looking to replicate what I've experienced with inbound referrals to getting to this point where I am playing a longer game and I'm okay with that. Instead of lead gen, it's a mindset change to building net new relationships. This goes back to the TAM issue. A lot of the sales advice that's out there, and if you're on LinkedIn and a doom scroll, chances are 99% of what you're seeing is focus on large TAM. So it's all these really cool, fancy plays where it's looking at triggers and all sorts of other stuff where there's a very large data set of companies. A lot of the stuff is based on selling transactional products like software or lower end agency services. If your TAM is relatively small, and a good way to visualize this is if you could more or less fit everybody that you could ever want to work with into a high school gymnasium, you are playing a fundamentally different game. So really what this means is starting to see your full sales cycle and reaching out to people before they have an actual need for what you're doing, because by then it's often too late or at least just not sustainable. So the next element of mindset is just some common head trash that we see from people once they've actually committed to prospecting and doing outbound consistently. The first, either said explicitly or implicitly, is my message needs to close the deal. So there's a lot of hand-wringing in terms of would somebody respond to this? Is this going to actually persuade people? And the reality is all your message is doing is de-risking a conversation and therefore a relationship with you. That's it. This is not unlike inbound marketing where you have a landing page and the landing page is only supposed to get somebody to the next step. It's not necessarily supposed to get somebody to buy, much less for whatever 5, 6, 7 figures, whatever you're charging. Here's the next piece of head trash, and it's prospecting means sending annoying spam. Not anymore. The fact is, with today's data tools, which I'll talk about a little bit coming up, as well as everything that you probably already have access to from building your agency over years, such as your network and the connections you have to others, you can really do this based on trust and a higher degree of relevance. You don't have to do the spray and pray game. And counter to that is the third piece of head trash, which is I'm stuck in this drudgery sending manual outreach all day. The fact is, there is a time and a place for manual outreach, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But in 2025, really a lot of what the work looks like is creative projects, creating systems, making it fun, working on copy. Outbound is becoming much more like managing an ad spend than it used to be. So for most of us, there's really not going to be this dialing for dollars drudgery, but it does have to be consistent. A last point on the mindset thing is that it is my belief, back to perspective, that all marketing is interruption marketing. I love Seth Godin. This is a thing that I disagree with him on. If you are sending an email to somebody, you're interrupting them. If you're reaching out on LinkedIn, you're interrupting them. If you're at a trade show and you tap somebody that you might want to work with on the shoulder and say, hey, I want to tell you about some recent work we did, you're interrupting them. If you cold call, you're interrupting them. But here's the other thing. If you pay a big tech company to hijack somebody's attention and serve ads to them, you are still interrupting them. You're taking them away through this addictive device from their kids and from more meaningful experiences so they can see your ad. And because you've outsourced that to a tech company, you are paying handsomely for that privilege so that you don't have to get your hands as dirty. So this isn't anything that's necessarily like negative or evil. I'm just saying, like, let's just acknowledge that in order to get beyond reactive referrals and things that are just organic, we're going to have to interrupt people to some extent. The question is, how can we do it in a way that's tasteful? How can we do it in a way that respects the limited size of our market? And how can we do it in a way that fits into our busy lives as agency owners or biz dev people who are wearing multiple hats? Subconsciously, I think when it comes to interrupting people, a lot of what people are worried about is like just not coming off as the common spam that's in their inbox. And that's pretty easily avoidable. But I think subconscious to that is a lot of the times we are not confident enough about what we're selling. I've definitely been in that place as our offer has gone through lots of twists and turns, and it sort of poisons the well. It makes everything else harder. So you may or may not have that problem, but if you think that you might, the way that I've found out of it is to really just keep building on the wins. Like, look at where you have had wins in the past, look at where you do have happy clients, and think of it kind of like you're climbing a wall if you've ever done rock climbing or bouldering, and you just have to get to the next foothold and build on the next one and get to there. I think all the talking to yourself in a mirror stuff and all the sports psychology, I think it's all crap. I don't think it really works. I think you have to build on these actual wins. But I think if you can just label, hey, I might be feeling this way, that is better than just saying, like, I don't want to bother people, because you're going to have to bother people at some point, and it's the reality. Great. So we talked about specialization. We talked about perspective. We talked about mindset and making all this stuff more consistent. The next foundational element before we can get to the tech nerdery is people. If you are in that cobbler's children phase or somewhere close to it, what this almost always means is that one owner is making new business their number one priority, perhaps for years. I know that sucks. I know it's not what you want to hear. I know you want me to say, hey, maybe after 3-6 months of working with Sales Schema or working with whatever other consultant, you are going to be able to get out of the sales seat. And yes, we could potentially help you do that, and others that are in the space could potentially help you do it faster, but it still is going to take a while. And that's because getting out of the sales seat is a multivariate problem, right? It involves solving the lead issue and getting not just the number of leads that you would need, but maybe 2x that amount in order to justify somebody else with a lower close rate who's going to be blowing up deals maybe for the first 6 to 12 months. It also ties into those other things we talked about earlier, like specialization, perspective, your offer. All that's going to come through trial and error. The mistake that we see very commonly, and I've made versions of this mistake, is hiring that salesperson prematurely before you have that offer nailed down. And even if you've been around for years and maybe you're at a 7-figure level, you still might be going through the sorts of changes that are going to make it very difficult for you to get sales completely off your plate. And if you do go out and hire that salesperson, they are going to interview well. And they may have already been very successful in previous lives. But chances are, if they were successful, they were successful within an existing system. So if you don't have that system, if you don't have that car, it becomes very difficult to hire that driver. And getting somebody in to go close deals on calls that they're getting is a different thing than saying, come into our business and build me this car. So what I've learned from lots of mistakes doing this is that to bring that salesperson in, you have to like fully catch the wave. If you've ever gone surfing, usually when you don't catch the wave, it's not because you over paddle, but it's because you under paddle and the wave hasn't like lifted you up and taken you away. And the wave hasn't like fully lifted you up and made gravity work in your favor. So that might sound like doom and gloom, but you can get help. If you're thinking about a lot of the tasks that we're going to get into when it comes to like building lists, setting up these systems, keeping you accountable, you can get somebody on your team to make that easier and to make it more systematized. So if you're an agency owner and you're hearing this and you're like, hey, I'm already wearing all these hats, I'm like stressed, I'm shuffling back and forth between client fires and prospecting and sales, really the first priority is getting as much of the client or the ops stuff off your plate so that you can focus on new business. Tied to that is also getting that help I talked about. It could be somebody that's helping with clients, but then is able to help you on certain sales tasks a few hours a week. But one thing to reiterate is that it's really important to have one person focused on it that has the time and motivation. I think a lot of the times we see when there's multiple partners, there'll be this kind of sales islands problem where one partner will handle a certain type of lead and another partner will handle another. Or there'll be this hand-wringing about, well, so-and-so has a bigger Rolodex, so maybe they should lead sales. The problem is, like, even if you do get some uptick from that, it'll sort of fizzle out when things get busy. You want to think more about the structure and who has the time and motivation to be doing this for a longer period of time. Great. So we talked about people, we talked about mindset, we talked about perspective, we talked about specialization. The next element is your new biz strategy, i.e. strategy is a word that gets overused, but what are the things you are going to prioritize, and then what's everything else that you are just not going to worry about right now? So I think a lot of the times people get overwhelmed because they overcomplicate this, frankly. They're thinking about all the different ways to look at the data, all the different tools they can use. Oftentimes that's the biggest problem, is starting with the software we're going to buy as opposed to what we're actually going to be doing, who's going to do it, and so on. And instead of channels or instead of tools, I think the right way to think about this is projects. And you may not have the same exact projects forever, but they should fit two big categories. The first project is your thought leadership project. Another way to think about this is it's a way to showcase your perspective. I think if you're deciding what to do here, you should really think about, back to specialization, how are the people you're reaching out to consuming information? For example, we worked with an agency that focuses on private equity companies, and his niche was constantly trading white papers and reading stuff, at least like at the older levels, the kind of more senior levels of these firms. So if it probably wouldn't make sense for him to start a YouTube channel. So that's the first project, is a way to showcase your perspective. The second is a project for building net new relationships. Notice I haven't used the phrase lead gen once. While you will get leads doing this and you will get lucky, the purpose of this is not really lead gen. That's going to come later, and I'll talk to you about how. So the fact is, it's kind of hard to have one of these projects going without the other. I think that as markets become more skeptical and trust becomes more of the scarce resource, both of these things kind of have to work together. Let me tell you what I mean. If you don't have a way to showcase your thought leadership, it becomes harder to build the relationship. And that's because the only way somebody can interact with you is through a sales conversation. And more what people are going to say is that I'm not going to talk to you until we have an immediate need. So you've got to find a way to build that relationship before that need happens. And on the other side, if you do have that thought leadership project, which I think a lot of agencies do, a lot have a newsletter or a podcast, or they're creating content, blog posts when they have time, but nobody's there to see it, you are just wasting so much time and so many resources kind of creating this tree falls in the woods dynamic. So you really got to have both. And the best that we've seen from agencies, we have this for ourselves, our best clients have it, is the two birds with one stone approach, where you have a way to build relationships using the thought leadership. The classic example of this is inviting prospects to come on your podcast to talk about solving a specific problem. Even if you don't want to start a podcast, you're not interested in that, limited interview series, they could be either written or they could be recorded. The fact is, like, sometimes I'll say that and people will be like, oh, I'm not an interviewer, I'm not doing this. And it's like, you're literally doing that all day with prospects and clients. You're just not like recording it or setting it up very cleanly. There's the metaphor, I know I use a lot of metaphors, of walking across a balance beam. If I put the balance beam on the floor, you would just run across it like it was nothing. If I raise it 3 feet in the air, you're wobbly, you're taking forever. But the reality is it's the same thing. Yes, the stakes are a little bit higher, but it doesn't take very long for you just to walk across the balance beam, even though it's a few feet in the air. It's basically the same skills. But even if you don't want to invite every prospect you have onto a podcast or an interview series or some other type of thought leadership, if we don't have that going for us, then the next thing we have to look at is building tribal trust through costly signals. I should have branded that better. I know it's a mouthful. So the way that I put that is like, how do we put ourselves a cut above 99% of people that are in the person's inbox? And how do we get across very quickly that I am in your world, I am an insider, not an outsider? Examples of that a lot of agencies are already doing, they're just not doing it very well, are mutual connections and contacts, basically reaching out based on those real connections, not the fake ones, getting referred, but doing it in a more systematic, proactive way. This is our referral engine process that I talked about in the past. You might be doing planned travel, either to visit clients or to go to conferences, or you might be even just thinking about doing that travel. Those are all opportunities to build relationships with prospects, either in those geographies or adjacent to those geographies. Another one that works very well is looking at your past clients and figuring out who used to work for these companies. It has now gone on to other firms that we might want to do business with. And then you're saying, hey, I saw you used to work with this company. We've done work with them for years. We usually find that our best clients come from these sorts of connections. Are you open to a casual conversation? That is going to de-risk so many more conversations than just going in cold. And that's another part of this, is back to that earlier mindset thing. Again, we're just trying to de-risk the conversation. We're not trying to close a deal with email or with LinkedIn or whatever it is. Great. So we've gone through these foundational elements, the strategy, i.e. the projects. We talked about who's going to be doing this to people. We talked about perspective and mindsets. We talked about specialization, perhaps not in that order. How do you actually get started? I think the first thing to do is to actually time block and think about the type of work that you're doing. So for example, the deep work that goes along with identifying your ICP, building out the data, looking at companies, disqualifying companies, looking at people, building the lists, setting up software is very different work than actually talking to prospects. So you don't want to have those task switching costs. You want to be able to have a good swath of time for the former compared to the latter. So actually getting that time blocked. If you haven't already done this, mapping your market can be one of the most useful and clarifying exercises you can do. For most of our clients, not always, but most of our clients find that their market, when they actually look at like the right fit companies that are at the right growth stages and that meet all the external criteria, they typically find that their market is smaller than they thought it was. And again, that's not a bad thing. It just means you're going to be playing a different game than what most sales tactics are telling you to do. To make this easier, we highly recommend starting with one ICP or ideal client profile. And the reason for that is the data is not as clean as we want it to be. And often the performance of the campaigns is as much about identifying the right companies and people as it is anything else that's fancier, like finding the ones that recently hired a new CMO or something like that. So for example, if you're looking to find fintech, there's not just one fintech button. You're looking at financial services labeled companies. You're also looking at companies that are labeled as computers and tech or whatever it is. And then you're using different tools to help you clean that data. To get into the actual tools, the way that we're starting with most clients is LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So we can go right to the source of the data without intermediaries. And then we're enriching it using Clay. Most of the time we're using formulas in Clay. So like AI is a word that everyone wants to throw around and use now, but formulas can get us very far in terms of like looking at LinkedIn descriptions to make sure that if a fintech company is out there, we're finding it, or if they are a bank, we're eliminating it, assuming we're going after fintech. Just doing that alone and being able to reach out and speak to a specific niche in their world will get you further than what most people are doing out there. So once we get the data from SalesNav, we're going into Clay. Back to that hospital example, if there's 600 hospitals, maybe there's 3 people that we would want to reach out to at each hospital. That's only 1,800 people that can more or less fit in a high school gymnasium. Going in cold and saying, hey, we're an agency, we're so awesome, look at our case studies, would be really dumb because almost nobody would respond to it. So we literally have a project like this going right now. What we're doing is we're looking at all those people. We're using formulas to figure out, okay, who are the ones in Boston, because we're helping our clients going to a trade show in a few months. Another are clients that used to work for our client's biggest hospital client. Said clients a lot there. You hopefully understand. For others, there might not be a connection, but they are a really good fit for our client's podcast. And they, based on titles and other things like that. So then we're reaching out with a softer ask, but it's still focused on perspective sharing and solving a particular problem. Hey, I'm doing an interview series about blah, blah, blah in hospitals, this problem that we solve, we should talk. So from a strategy like this, we've seen agencies consistently hit 2 to 5 appointments a week. And this brings us to the next thing to really bring into this, which is a simple measurement system. And really what we like is the LAPS framework. So measuring leads. I know I said not to use lead. I would just think about this as people putting up their hand, agreeing to speak with you as like somebody entering your world. Positive signal is a lead. Appointments, self-explanatory. Proposals, self-explanatory. Sales, also self-explanatory. So you're measuring all these things on a week-by-week basis so you can really see what your close rate actually is. Because if most of your business has been from referrals, the reality is you don't really know your close rate yet, at least not as it applies to a more repeatable and systematic new business process. So everything I've talked about with all of these trust building approaches and these strategies and the software, the data, and the people is all meant to be largely automated or at the very least systematized. The work lives with setup and managing the system on a weekly basis. And for most of our clients that we're helping get this sort of thing set up, it's 5 to 10 total team hours in the first 90 days. And then it can sort of trail off to about 2 to 5. It sounds pretty awesome, right? You're like getting these appointments in without a whole ton of work. And it is. But here's the catch. It does not cancel out the need for manual outreach. What we're talking about and what we've talked about so far is focused on relationship building. It's not lead generation most of the time. It can be when we're lucky, but that's not the focus. If you want to talk about lead generation and you want to talk about by far the highest ROI activity in our company and our better clients organizations, it lies with manual outreach. It's a very high leverage activity. By manual outreach, I mean writing a custom email. The problem is that many agency owners and new business people put this leverage at the wrong places. For example, they do manual outreach to build relationships with cold prospects. I'm not saying that that never works, but the chances of that actually breaking through nowadays and that being worth the collective time and effort that you have put in is very small. So where do you put this leverage of writing the custom email? What we found is that it's A, to happy clients that have maybe churned or paused for whatever reason, and B, to prospects that you have talked to and have had good rapport with 90 to 365 days ago. So I still do this in my own company every single week. What I do to give you my full process soups and nuts is just set a goal of reaching out to 15 prospects that meet this criteria. We have a very simple filter in our CRM that says who hasn't gotten a manual touch, 90 plus days ago. And then I send an email that I have a template for, but I customize slightly for each situation. And I'll go ahead and read it. I know I'm looking down and reading. So it's something to this effect, and it changes a little each time, but it almost always follows this pattern. And the subject line is reconnecting, following up on our conversation from March 2023. It's something that's very specific that looks like you would get from somebody because I do know this person. I'm saying, hi, Jake, wanted to reach back since it's been a while. When we spoke back in Q1 of this year, it sounded like you were in the process of hiring a biz dev person, so I was curious how that's panned out. So that first line is always specific to our conversation. An experiment I'm running right now is actually linking to the Fathom recording from our call so that they can look back and see what they actually talked about at a glance, because there's summary and all sorts of stuff there. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, for the next paragraph, I'm saying there are a couple of new outbound approaches we're running and I have an idea that could be interesting for an agency like Acme based on our previous conversation. Free to catch up next week. By the way, tactical stuff I like to do next week because people are always overwhelmed in the given week, but next week may as well be a month away, and I find I get more calls that way. So that's the message. What I do use automation for is there's a tool that I use called Rebump, REBUMP, and I basically just have it send an automated email if they don't reply a week later. And it just says, hey, checking back on this. And we tend to get more responses on that one. If they don't reply to that one, then I leave them be. But that one email or various versions of it is responsible for more revenue in our company by far than anything else. If we're looking at the 80-20 of what works, it's that. This is where lead generation lives for complex service companies. It's not so much building net new relationships, which are totally necessary and the fuel for this. If you don't do this, if you don't do the other thing, you don't get to enjoy the lead gen. But the lead generation actually lives with this sort of manual follow-up. So the good news is you can really systematize it, and it just means like budgeting the time as opposed to creating a really fancy system for automating something like this. So to wrap things up, building a more repeatable and reliable new business system isn't just about implementing tactics or software. It's about more fundamental changes. in terms of your mindset, in terms of specialization, your perspective, and the people doing this. Everything I've went over, whether we're working with clients or just observing the best agencies out there, most of them have gone through a process like this in order to get owners out of the sales seat and avoid being that bottleneck forever, and to build organizations that have high equity value. I know this sounds like a lot of work and it may be a little bit intimidating, but it's really worth it, because once you've been able to do this, then you get a situation where you can grow, you can plan, you can choose your clients instead of the other way around. You can open up all sorts of time and freedom by getting out of that sales seat. And you can build an organization that somebody would actually want to buy. So with that, I hope this episode has been helpful. As always, if you have questions or you want to jam on this with me, feel free to reach out, dan@saleschema.com, and look forward to catching you on the next episode of the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. Thank you.